On the final day of 2024, inside an apartment high above Manhattan, 84-year-old Jocelyn Wildenstein was found dead in her bed. By then, almost everything that had once defined her life was gone. The private jets, the African estate, the diamonds, the dinners surrounded by billionaires, and access to one of the most secretive art fortunes in the world. Decades earlier, Jocelyn had walked through private vaults filled with masterpieces by artists like Vermeer and Caravaggio. She had married into the Wildenstein dynasty and lived inside a fortune worth billions. Yet near the end of her life, the woman once associated with unimaginable wealth had almost nothing left. And when the world remembered her, it rarely remembered the art, the marriage, or the extraordinary life that came before. It remembered her face. For nearly 30 years, tabloids turned that face into a nickname, a spectacle, and eventually a punchline. But behind those photographs was a very different story. A story about a Swiss woman who entered one of the world's most guarded family fortunes, fell deeply in love with the man inside it, and slowly discovered that the paintings, the houses, the money, and perhaps even the husband she loved had never truly belonged to her. Chapter 1: The Swiss Girl Who Wanted More. Jocelyn Wildenstein's story began far from Manhattan penthouses and billion-dollar art collections. She was born in Lausanne, Switzerland, in 1940. Her father ran a sporting goods business, selling things like skis and rifles. The family lived comfortably, but they were nowhere close to wealthy. From an early age, Jocelyn seemed determined to see a larger world. She learned languages and became fascinated by the fashion magazines arriving from Paris, Milan, and London. But she was not simply interested in glamour. At 13, Jocelyn was already riding horses through the hills surrounding Lausanne. By 16, she had become an accomplished shooter, confident enough with a rifle to compete alongside men at a local club. At the time, these seemed like ordinary hobbies. Years later, they would help lead her directly to the man who changed her life. Jocelyn was also striking. Tall, slender, and dark-eyed, she began doing occasional modeling and hostess work in Geneva before eventually moving into the social circles of Paris. She had little money, but she watched carefully. She learned how wealthy Europeans dressed, traveled, and entertained. More importantly, she learned how their world worked. In 1964, at 24, Jocelyn married an Italian film and music producer named Cyril Piguet. The marriage lasted only a few years and produced no children. After it ended, Jocelyn continued moving between Geneva, Paris, and Rome. During the 1970s, her social circle began to include wealthy men who traveled internationally to hunt. And here, Jocelyn was different from many of the women around them. She could ride. She could shoot. She understood animals. And she was perfectly comfortable spending nights in remote safari camps rather than luxury hotels. She traveled through Africa, including Tanzania and Sudan, gradually becoming familiar with the world of wealthy international hunters. Then, in 1977, when Jocelyn was 37, she accepted an invitation to another hunting expedition. This one took her to Kenya. The destination was a vast private ranch beneath the Aberdare Range called Ol Jogi. It covered tens of thousands of acres, and it belonged to a family named Wildenstein. Other members of the hunting party tried to explain the name to Jocelyn, the galleries, the paintings, the enormous fortune. But Jocelyn barely reacted. She returned her attention to her rifle. Somewhere on that ranch was a 37-year-old man named Alec Wildenstein. He was the eldest son of one of the most powerful art-dealing families in the world. That evening, Alec and Jocelyn met over dinner. The following morning, they rode together across the Kenyan landscape. Then they rode together again. And again. Alec was accustomed to meeting people who already understood what his surname meant. Jocelyn was different. She did not seem intimidated by his wealth. She could talk about horses, she could handle a rifle, and she appeared more interested in Africa than in his bank account. For Alec, that was unusual. For Jocelyn, it was the beginning of everything. Within months, their relationship became serious. And within a year, Jocelyn would marry Alec Wildenstein and enter a world more extravagant than anything she had imagined from the magazines of her childhood. But there was one person who wanted to keep her out: Alec's father, Daniel Wildenstein. Chapter 2: A Wildenstein. Alec Wildenstein had been born in Paris in 1940, the same year as Jocelyn. But unlike her, Alec entered the world already surrounded by extraordinary wealth. The Wildenstein fortune had been built over generations through art. It began with Alec's great-grandfather, Nathan Wildenstein, who started dealing in old master paintings in Paris during the late 19th century. His son George expanded the business internationally. Then came Alec's father, Daniel Wildenstein. Under Daniel, the family became one of the most powerful names in the international art market. Their galleries connected them with some of the world's richest collectors. But Daniel's influence went far beyond simply buying and selling paintings. He produced authoritative catalogs for artists such as Monet, Manet, and Gauguin. In the art world, that gave him enormous power. If a painting was accepted as authentic, it could be worth millions. If it was rejected, its value could collapse. And Daniel believed deeply in secrecy. The family's assets were spread through trusts, companies, and offshore structures. Paintings worth fortunes could sit inside private storage rooms for decades, almost completely hidden from public view. Alec and his younger brother Guy grew up inside this system. From childhood, they were taught to recognize artists, understand collectors, and protect the family business. By adulthood, Alec spoke several languages and moved effortlessly between Paris, New York, and the family's international properties. But his great passion outside art was Africa. In the early 1970s, the Wildensteins acquired Old Jogi in Kenya. The enormous ranch became one of Alec's favorite places. There, far from galleries and collectors, he could ride, hunt, and disappear into the landscape for weeks. And it was there that Jocelyn entered his life. Their connection developed quickly. She understood horses. She could shoot. She loved Africa. And unlike many people Alec encountered, she did not seem fascinated by the Wildenstein name. Within months, Alec decided he wanted to marry her. Daniel was furious. To him, Jocelyn was an outsider. She was divorced. She had no significant family fortune. She had no established position in the art world. And Daniel had spent his life protecting a dynasty built over generations. He did not believe Jocelyn belonged inside it. Alec ignored him. On April 30th, 1978, less than a year after meeting, Alec and Jocelyn married at Old Jogi. The ceremony was small, with roughly 20 guests. Daniel did not attend. Neither did Alec's younger brother, Guy. Jocelyn had finally entered the Wildenstein family. But from the very beginning, she understood that carrying the name and being accepted by the dynasty were two very different things. Then came the children. Their daughter Diane was born in 1979. Their son Alec Jr. followed in 1980. The grandchildren slowly softened Daniel's resistance, and Jocelyn was gradually allowed deeper into the family's world. She attended dinners in Paris. She entered the Manhattan Gallery. She met collectors, dealers, and museum figures. And for the first time, she began to understand the true scale of the fortune surrounding her. There were magnificent homes, private aircraft, jewelry, Old Jogi, and walls covered with paintings worth millions. But the most valuable treasures were not hanging where guests could see them. They were hidden away. And when Jocelyn was finally allowed into the Wildenstein's private storage rooms, she discovered something far more important than how rich the family really was. She discovered how little of that wealth actually belonged to her. Chapter 3. The Wife. After the birth of their children, Jocelyn slowly became part of the Wildenstein world. The lifestyle was extraordinary. The family maintained magnificent homes in New York and Paris, a chalet in the French Alps, and the enormous Old Jogi Ranch in Kenya. Private aircraft carried them between continents. Their walls were decorated with paintings most people would only expect to see inside major museums. Jocelyn adapted quickly. She wore couture, collected expensive jewelry, and became an accomplished hostess. She learned how to entertain collectors, bankers, museum directors, and members of European high society. She understood where people should sit, which guests should meet, and how to create the kind of dinner that could quietly become part of the family's business. But Old Jogi remained especially important to her. In Kenya, Jocelyn became involved with the ranch, its horses and conservation programs. It connected her new life to the girl she had once been in Switzerland. For a time, the marriage seemed almost perfect. Alec had his art, hunting and horses. Jocelyn had her children, entertaining, travel, and Africa. And surrounding them was wealth on a scale few people could imagine. Then, Alec showed her something most outsiders never saw: the family's private art storage. Behind secured doors were paintings stacked and stored away from public view. Old masters, impressionists, works worth millions. Jocelyn was astonished, but as Alec explained the collection, she began asking questions. Who owns this painting? One trust. And this one? Another company. What about their New York residence? Family controlled. Old Jogi? Held through another structure. The aircraft? Again, not necessarily owned personally by Alec. The paintings hanging inside their homes? Many were part of the family inventory. Jocelyn suddenly understood something disturbing. She was living inside enormous wealth. She could use it, travel through it, wear it, sleep surrounded by it. But very little of it actually belonged to her, and perhaps not much of it belonged directly to Alec either. The fortune had been deliberately structured to remain inside the Wildenstein family. For the moment, that hardly mattered. The bills were paid, the planes were available, the houses were open to her. But if the marriage ever ended, everything could change. And during the years that followed, Jocelyn began to realize that her marriage was not as secure as the fortune surrounding it. Alec was spending more time away. There were rumors of other women. Then suspicions. Then arguments. Jocelyn wanted the man she had met in Kenya, the man who had once ridden beside her for hours and seemed completely fascinated by her. Instead, she increasingly found herself competing for his attention. And somewhere during those years, she began changing her appearance. At first, the cosmetic procedures were relatively subtle, work around the eyes, changes intended to preserve youth and beauty. Jocelyn later connected some of those choices to Alec's fascination with feline features and big cats. But one procedure was followed by another. Her eyes changed, her cheeks changed, her face gradually became different from the one Alec had first seen across the campfire in Kenya. And while Jocelyn's appearance was changing, the marriage was changing with it. Soon, strangers would begin noticing her face, then photographers, then the tabloids. And once they did, Jocelyn Wildenstein would become famous for something she never intended to be famous for. Chapter 4. The Face the World Remembered. By the early 1990s, the changes to Jocelyn's appearance were becoming impossible to ignore. What had begun with relatively modest cosmetic procedures gradually became more dramatic. Her eyes appeared more feline. Her cheeks became fuller. The shape of her face changed. Jocelyn later said Alec loved big cats and admired their features. Whether that was the original motivation or not, the connection soon became central to the way the public saw her. Photographers began noticing. Then the tabloids did. Old photographs were placed beside new ones. Journalists speculated about how many procedures she had undergone and how much they had cost. Soon, they gave her the nickname that would follow her for the rest of her life. Catwoman. Jocelyn hated the label. She argued that the press exaggerated her surgeries and insisted that some of her distinctive features were natural. But the story was already beyond her control. To the public, she was no longer simply Jocelyn Wildenstein, wife of a powerful art dealer. She had become a spectacle. And behind the headlines, her marriage was deteriorating. Alec spent increasing amounts of time away. Jocelyn suspected affairs. Arguments became more frequent. The couple who had once ridden together across Kenya were now living increasingly separate lives. Yet, leaving Alec presented another problem. Jocelyn understood the Wildenstein finances well enough to know that divorce would not be simple. The paintings were controlled through family structures. The properties were held through companies and trusts. Even the extraordinary lifestyle she had enjoyed did not prove that Alec personally owned the assets supporting it. If the marriage ended, Jocelyn might have to fight an entire financial system designed specifically to keep the Wildenstein fortune inside the family. So she stayed. For a while. Then, in September 1997, everything changed. Jocelyn returned to their Manhattan residence and discovered Alec with another woman. Years of suspicion suddenly became undeniable. The confrontation escalated. According to Jocelyn, Alec appeared with a gun and threatened her. Police were called. Alec Wildenstein was arrested. For a family that had spent generations protecting its privacy, the incident was disastrous. Reporters gathered. Photographers waited outside, and the tabloids suddenly had everything they wanted. A billionaire art dealer, his famous wife, another woman, a gun, an arrest, and a marriage collapsing behind the doors of one of New York's wealthiest families. This time, Jocelyn was finished. She filed for divorce. But ending the marriage meant answering a question the Wildensteins had spent generations making extraordinarily difficult to answer. How much was Alec Wildenstein actually worth? Chapter 5. The Divorce War. Jocelyn's divorce from Alec quickly became one of the most sensational battles New York society had seen. The problem was not proving that Alec lived like an extraordinarily wealthy man. Everyone could see that. The problem was proving what he actually owned. The Wildenstein fortune was spread across family trusts, companies, properties, and art holdings. Paintings worth millions could be controlled by one entity, while a house or aircraft belonged to another. Jocelyn had lived inside this system for nearly 20 years. Now her lawyers had to untangle it. She hired divorce attorney Bernard Clare, and his team began asking questions the Wildensteins did not want answered. Who owned the Manhattan properties? Who controlled Old Jogie? Which paintings belonged personally to Alec? How much income did he actually receive? And how much wealth was hidden behind family-controlled structures? For the Wildensteins, this was dangerous. A divorce could force private financial records into court, and privacy had always been one of the foundations of their empire. The longer the battle continued, the more pressure increased. Meanwhile, the tabloids followed every development. But instead of focusing on trusts, paintings, and hidden wealth, they repeatedly returned to Jocelyn's appearance. Her face became inseparable from the divorce. The press called her Catwoman. Another nickname soon appeared, the Bride of Wildenstein. Jocelyn kept fighting. She argued that after nearly 2 decades of marriage, raising 2 children, and helping maintain the family's social life, she deserved financial security comparable to the extraordinary lifestyle Alec had provided. Eventually, the 2 sides reached an agreement. In 1999, the divorce was finalized. Reports claimed Jocelyn received approximately $2.5 billion, along with annual payments, reportedly worth around $100 million for 13 years. The numbers made headlines around the world. A woman who had once struggled financially in Paris now appeared to be leaving her marriage as one of the richest divorced women on earth. There was even an unusual condition attached to the case. The judge reportedly ordered Jocelyn not to use her settlement money for additional cosmetic surgery. Naturally, that detail became another tabloid sensation. But Jocelyn had achieved something far more important. For the first time since marrying Alec, she appeared to possess financial independence. No Daniel, no Alec. No need to ask the Wildenstein family for access to their money. She could finally build a life that belonged entirely to her. At least, that was how it looked. Because the enormous settlement created the impression that Jocelyn's wealth could never disappear. And for years, she continued spending as though that were true. Luxury apartments, designer clothing, jewelry, travel, staff. An extraordinarily expensive lifestyle that had originally been supported by a multi-generational dynasty. Then Alec Wildenstein died in 2008. According to Jocelyn, the payments she expected to continue receiving eventually stopped. The money coming in changed. Her lifestyle did not change nearly as quickly. And slowly, the fortune that had seemed impossible to exhaust began to disappear. Chapter 6. The money begins to vanish. For years after the divorce, Jocelyn continued living much as she had before. There were luxury apartments, designer clothes, expensive jewelry, fine restaurants, travel, and the kind of spending that had become normal during her marriage to Alec. From the outside, she still appeared extraordinarily wealthy, but maintaining the Wildenstein lifestyle without the Wildenstein fortune behind it was enormously expensive. And after Alec died in 2008, Jocelyn claimed that the annual payments she had expected eventually stopped. The consequences were serious. Her income had changed dramatically. Her habits had not. Money continued flowing out. Assets could be sold. Jewelry could be turned into cash. Possessions accumulated during decades of wealth could temporarily cover expenses. But none of that replaced a reliable income. Slowly, the financial foundation beneath Jocelyn began to collapse. At the same time, another man had become important in her life. Lloyd Klein, a Canadian-born fashion designer who was significantly younger than Jocelyn. The two appeared together at restaurants, parties, and fashion events. For Jocelyn, Lloyd offered something increasingly rare: companionship. He defended her publicly and stood beside her while the tabloids continued mocking her appearance. But their relationship was volatile. In December 2016, an argument inside Jocelyn's Manhattan apartment became physical. Police were called. Jocelyn was arrested. Only weeks later, another confrontation brought police attention again, this time involving allegations against Lloyd. Despite everything, the couple reconciled. They remained together. But by then, Jocelyn's financial problems were becoming impossible to hide. In 2018, the woman once associated with a multi-billion-dollar divorce settlement filed for bankruptcy. The news shocked the public. How could someone who had reportedly received billions end up without enough money to maintain her life? The answer was not one enormous purchase. It was years of extraordinary spending combined with the loss of the continuing payments Jocelyn said she had depended upon. The fortune had not vanished overnight. It had disappeared gradually, year after year, until eventually, the illusion of unlimited wealth could no longer survive. Jocelyn had once learned that living among billions did not mean those billions belonged to her. Now she was learning an even harsher lesson. Even a fortune that appears enormous can disappear when the life built around it costs more than the money still coming in. Chapter 7. The Woman Behind the Headlines. Bankruptcy changed the way the world looked at Jocelyn Wildenstein. For decades, she had been portrayed as a woman surrounded by unlimited money. Now that image was collapsing. But even as her fortune disappeared, the tabloids remained obsessed with the same thing: her face. The nickname Catwoman followed her everywhere. Old photographs were constantly compared with new ones. Stories about her marriage, her years in Africa, and the extraordinary art world she had once inhabited were pushed into the background. Jocelyn repeatedly rejected that version of herself. She insisted the press had exaggerated the extent of her cosmetic surgery. She argued that some of her distinctive features were natural and even pointed to family photographs as evidence. But changing the public narrative proved almost impossible. For millions of people, the photograph had become more powerful than the person. And there was a strange irony in that. Jocelyn had spent decades around an art dynasty obsessed with provenance, who owned something, where it came from, and whether the story attached to it was authentic. Yet, she had lost control over the story attached to her own life. Still, Jocelyn refused to disappear. She continued dressing elegantly. She went to restaurants. She appeared publicly with Lloyd Klein. And she continued giving interviews in an attempt to explain the woman behind the headlines. She spoke about Switzerland, about horses, about Africa, about Alec, and about the life she had lived before the world became fascinated with her appearance. Old Jogi remained especially powerful in her memory. It was where she had met Alec, where they had fallen in love, where they had married, and where Jocelyn had once believed she had finally found the extraordinary life she had dreamed about as a girl. But that world was gone now. Daniel was dead. Alec was dead. The marriage had ended decades earlier. The fortune had largely disappeared from her life. And many of the people who once filled her dinners and parties were no longer around. By her 80s, Jocelyn's world had become much smaller. What remained was Lloyd, her memories, and a public identity she was still trying to reclaim. Because after losing the marriage, the money and access to the Wildenstein dynasty, Jocelyn was fighting for the one thing she believed still belonged to her: her own story. Chapter 8. The Final Years. By the early 2020s, Jocelyn Wildenstein was living a very different life from the woman who had once traveled between New York, Paris, Kenya, and the French Alps. The private aircraft were gone, the enormous fortune was gone, and the Wildenstein dynasty had become part of her past. But Jocelyn continued appearing in public. Lloyd Klein remained beside her, and despite their turbulent history, the relationship endured. She still dressed carefully. She still enjoyed restaurants and fashion, and she continued pushing back against the image the tabloids had created. Jocelyn wanted people to understand that her life had been about more than cosmetic surgery. She had been a writer, a hunter, a mother, a hostess, a woman who had lived for years inside one of the most secretive art dynasties in the world, and she had witnessed things very few outsiders had ever seen. But time was running out. In December 2024, Jocelyn was photographed with Lloyd in Manhattan. She was 84. It seemed like another ordinary public appearance from a woman photographers had followed for decades. It would become one of her last. On December 31st, 2024, inside her apartment at Trump World Tower, Jocelyn died in her sleep. Lloyd later said the cause was a pulmonary embolism. The woman who had once lived among paintings worth hundreds of millions of dollars was gone. And almost immediately, the familiar headlines returned. Her face, her surgeries, Catwoman. The same image that had followed her for decades followed her into death. But Jocelyn Wildenstein's life had begun long before any of those headlines existed. It began with a girl in Lausanne staring beyond the mountains. A girl who wanted adventure, beauty, and a life larger than the one she had been given. She eventually found all of it. In Kenya, she found Alec. Through Alec, she entered the Wildenstein dynasty, and inside that dynasty, she discovered a world of masterpieces, private estates, and extraordinary wealth. But she also learned the difference between being surrounded by something and truly possessing it. The marriage disappeared. The access disappeared. Eventually, much of the money disappeared too. And in the end, perhaps the most valuable thing Jocelyn lost was not measured in dollars. It was control over how the world remembered her. Because behind the face that became famous was an entire life. And that life was far more complicated than the photograph. Chapter 9. The Art War. Jocelyn's divorce had ended years earlier, but the Wildenstein family was entering another battle. This time, the fight was not over a marriage. It was over the fortune itself. When Daniel Wildenstein died in 2001, his widow, Sylvia, expected to inherit part of the family wealth. Instead, she was told there was almost nothing. The explanation was familiar. The paintings were held by trusts. The properties belonged to companies. The fortune existed everywhere, yet apparently very little belonged directly to Daniel. Sylvia did not believe it. She went to court. And for the first time, the financial structures that had protected the Wildenstein dynasty for generations began attracting serious scrutiny. Investigators examined offshore trusts, companies, and enormous collections of art. Questions emerged about paintings stored away from public view and about who legally controlled them. After Sylvia died, other heirs continued the fight. French authorities eventually opened investigations into the family's financial arrangements. For Jocelyn, none of this was surprising. Years earlier, during her own divorce, she had confronted the same strange reality. The Wildensteins could live like billionaires while arguing that many of the assets surrounding them technically belonged somewhere else. A painting might hang inside a family residence without belonging to the person living there. An estate might be controlled through a company. An enormous collection could exist behind layers of trusts. It was a system designed to preserve wealth across generations, and it worked extraordinarily well. The Wildenstein family remained powerful in the art world. Guy Wildenstein continued the family business. The galleries remained influential. The paintings continued moving through private collections, but the secrecy that had once protected the dynasty now attracted attention. Jocelyn had entered that world believing she had married into unimaginable wealth. She left it believing she had secured her own fortune. Yet decades later, the same question still followed both her and the Wildensteins. Who actually owned the billions? For Jocelyn, the answer no longer mattered. She had already lost access to that world. But the legal battles surrounding the Wildenstein fortune revealed something she had learned long before everyone else. Inside this family, seeing wealth was easy. Proving who owned it was much harder. Chapter 10. What the headlines left out. For most of the world, Jocelyn Wildenstein's story eventually became very simple. She was the billionaire's wife who changed her face. That was the version repeated for decades. But it left out almost everything that came before. Before the tabloids, there was Lausanne. There was a young woman learning to ride horses and shoot rifles. There was Paris, where she lived with little money while trying to enter a world that seemed far beyond her reach. Then there was Kenya, Old Jogi. Alec, the marriage, 2 children, and nearly 20 years spent inside one of the most private art dynasties in the world. Jocelyn had seen masterpieces hidden from public view. She had lived among extraordinary wealth. She had watched the Wildenstein family protect that wealth through trusts, companies, and layers of secrecy. And when her marriage collapsed, she fought that system herself. The divorce appeared to make her extraordinarily rich. But the money did not give Jocelyn what she may have wanted most: security. The payments she expected eventually stopped. Her spending continued, the fortune declined, and by 2018, she was bankrupt. Yet the public remained fascinated by something else: her appearance. That became the tragedy of Jocelyn's public life. The more famous she became, the less people seemed to know about her. By the time she reached her final years, Jocelyn was still trying to correct that story. She wanted people to remember Africa, the horses, the family she had raised, the life before the photographs. But some stories become too powerful to erase. On December 31st, 2024, Jocelyn died in Manhattan at the age of 84. And once again, many headlines returned to the same nickname that had followed her for decades: Catwoman. But Jocelyn Wildenstein had been far more than that. She had spent her life reaching for worlds that seemed inaccessible. And for a time, she reached one of the most extraordinary of all. She entered a dynasty built on priceless art and carefully guarded wealth. She lived inside it. She loved inside it. And eventually, she lost almost everything that had connected her to it. What remained was the image the world remembered, and the much larger story behind it that most people never knew. Chapter 11. The Last Fortune. There was one final irony in Jocelyn Wildenstein's story. She had spent much of her adult life surrounded by objects whose value depended on history. A painting could be worth millions because of who created it, who owned it, and the story that followed it through generations. The Wildensteins understood that better than almost anyone, but Jocelyn never gained the same control over her own history. The tabloids chose the image they wanted: the face, the surgeries, the nickname, and once that image became famous, everything else became harder to see. By her final years, Jocelyn no longer possessed the extraordinary lifestyle she once knew, but she still carried the memories of it. The first rides with Alec across Old Jogi, their wedding in Kenya, the children, the private galleries, the paintings hidden behind locked doors, the dinners in New York and Paris, and the years when she believed she had finally reached the world she had dreamed about as a young woman in Switzerland. Perhaps that is the real contradiction of Jocelyn Wildenstein. She succeeded in reaching almost everything she once wanted: wealth, adventure, status, luxury, a life far beyond Lausanne. But none of it proved permanent. The marriage ended. The fortune slipped away. And the identity the public gave her became more enduring than anything money had ever purchased. In the end, Jocelyn's story was never simply about cosmetic surgery. It was about what happens when love, money, and identity become tied to a world you can enter, but never completely own. And after all the billions, the masterpieces, and the headlines, that may have been the one lesson the Wildenstein fortune could never protect her from. Chapter 12. What Remains. Jocelyn Wildenstein spent decades chasing a larger life. She found it in places most people would never enter: private galleries in Manhattan, elegant homes in Paris, a vast ranch beneath the mountains of Kenya, rooms filled with paintings worth fortunes. For a time, it seemed she had escaped the ordinary life she feared as a young woman in Switzerland. But wealth could not protect her from betrayal. The divorce gave her independence, but not permanence. The money eventually disappeared. The marriage became history, and the face the tabloids mocked became more famous than the woman behind it. When Jocelyn died on December 31st, 2024, she left behind two very different stories. One was the story the world already knew: the surgeries, the photographs, the nickname, Catwoman. But the other story was far more complicated. It was about a young Swiss woman who crossed continents, fell in love in Kenya, married into one of the world's most secretive art dynasties, lived among extraordinary wealth, and then watched that world slowly disappear. Perhaps Jocelyn's greatest mistake was believing that access meant ownership. She had access to the houses, the aircraft, the paintings, the money, even the Wildenstein name, but almost everything belonged to structures larger than herself. And eventually, almost everything was taken away. Except the story. Because behind the photographs was a woman who had lived an extraordinary life, a life filled with ambition, love, excess, betrayal, and loss. Jocelyn Wildenstein reached the world she had dreamed about as a girl. She simply discovered that getting inside was much easier than staying there. The end. Jocelyn Wildenstein's life began in Lausanne and ended high above Manhattan. Between those two places came a journey almost impossible to imagine. Africa, Alec, the Wildenstein dynasty, priceless paintings, billions of dollars, a spectacular divorce, and finally, the loss of almost everything she had once believed was permanent. But perhaps the most revealing part of her story is not how much money she gained or how much she eventually lost. It is how completely a human life can disappear behind a public image. For decades, millions of people recognized Jocelyn's face without knowing the woman behind it. They knew the nickname. They knew the photographs, but they rarely knew the story. And maybe that is why Jocelyn Wildenstein remains so fascinating, because beneath all the wealth, scandal, and spectacle was something surprisingly human. A woman who spent her entire life searching for something more. She found it, she lived it, and eventually she learned that even the most extraordinary worlds can disappear.